Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe lived from 1809 to 1849. His father abandoned the family when he was an infant. His mother died when he was only 2 years old. After this, he was split from his siblings and taken in by the Allan family. Mrs. Allan was nurturing to him. However, Mr. Allan was a tough person and the two never got along. The Allans were a wealthy family, so he was raised in a wealthy atmosphere. But he was separated from his peers somewhat because he didn't stand to inherit from the Allans. So he never really was viewed as moneyed, even though he lived nicely as a child. At age 18, he fell in love with a wealthy young woman, but her parents forced her to break off the relationship because he ultimately didn't stand to inherit money. He then went to the University of West Virginia, and while the Allans paid for his school and his expenses, they didn't give him a lot of spending money like many of his wealthy peers. So he began gambling and got into a huge debt. As a result, he was disowned by the Allans. He then joined the Navy, but Mrs. Allan was able to get a reconciliation between Edgar and his grandfather, so they got him into West Point. However, soon after this, Mrs. Allan died, and Edgar's relationship with his grandfather again soured. As a result, Edgar ended up being kicked out of West Point because Mr. Allan wouldn't pay his expenses. At this point, Poe became attached to the Poe family, his father's parents, and his aunt, Maria Clem. He goes to live with Maria Clem and falls in love with her daughter, his cousin, Virginia. So when Poe is 26 years old, he marries Virginia, who was only 13 years old at the time. Poe had some psychological problems as well as issues with gambling and with alcohol. But he was able to provide for his wife working as a magazine editor. For the 13 years that they were married, his life was pretty stable. But at age 26, Virginia died of tuberculosis. This shattered him. After a year, Poe returned to where he'd grown up and fell back in love with his boyhood sweetheart, who was now a wealthy widow. They became engaged, so he returned to Baltimore to fix up some loose ends and was going to return so they could have a wonderful life together. But he was found on a sidewalk in Baltimore, bruised and bloodied, and died a few days later without regaining consciousness. It's believed he became involved in some election fraud scam and was beaten up as a result. He was 40 years old when he died. Poe believed in many of the concepts within Gnosticism. This is a religion or philosophy that emerged at about the same time as Christianity. It generally views the world as a very bad place, full of evil. Gnosticism views the world as in a fallen state. But the Gnostics believe there's a secret knowledge that one could obtain that would carry them back to heaven or to some original state of bliss. Poe believed that the universe was originally in a state of unity with the physical, spiritual, and divine. At some point, the universe degenerated into diversity, or disunity. The physical world, which is broken, split, or multiple, is a result of this fall, because it's now separated from the spiritual. Poe believed that his time marked the end of the diversity, and that there would be a natural swing back towards this original unity. He felt that the role of the poet or writer was to help get us back to this unity. This led to his belief in destructive transcendence. This is the concept that the original unity would be restored when the physical world and the separation of the physical and spiritual was destroyed. The phrase he used to describe this was, dreaming the oak tree back into the acorn. In other words, let's destroy this world and get back to this original peace. Of course, this has depressive or suicidal overtones to it. He felt this all required a change in state of mind, plus ultimately destroying the physical world as well. He considered his art as a ritual reenactment of the process of destructive transcendence. All of Poe's stories seem to follow some variation on the process of destructive transcendence. Often this involves the destruction of the rational mind. Some literary critics have said that his attention to this reflects his personal state of mind at the time. This view would indicate that Poe's stories aren't exactly the formulations he suggested, but rather a psychologically necessary form of repetition or compulsion. Note that in most of his stories, a main character goes from rational to ultimately insane. Many of his stories also involve the death or demise of a beautiful young woman. This may be due to important women in his life dying. His mother, Mrs. Allan, and Virginia all died at younger ages. In his stories, women are portrayed as objects to be possessed. They're necessary for male completion. They are not portrayed as unique, full characters of their own. Poe wrote a very influential essay during his time, entitled The Philosophy of Composition. In it, he argued that a quality short story should be written so that it can be read in one sitting. The author must intend to produce a single effect in the reader, often horror. And he tried to craft his stories so that every word he chose would somehow contribute to that effect. For example, just in choosing a particular sound to a word, he wanted it to somehow help add to the aura that he was building. Some say this is a bit pompous and not realistic to actually do, but Poe claimed that was part of his formula of writing stories. Maybe this was just Poe trying to glorify himself a bit too much. Note that all of Poe's short stories are written in first person. Within this week's discussion board, we're going to discuss why he might have made that choice.